You think you know how the story goes? A lonely farmer gives a thirsty girl a cup of water. The next day, her entire tribe shows up at his door. You're probably thinking it's a story about revenge or a misunderstanding. But you'd be wrong. What happened on that Nebraska farm was stranger than any revenge plot. It was a story of secrets, of a hidden world, and of a choice that would echo for generations. And it all started with the merciless copper sun. The sun was a killer. It hung in the Nebraska sky like an open furnace door, baking the life out of everything. Daniel Reed felt it on the back of his neck, a physical weight, a promise of death. It was the third week of a drought so bad the devil himself would have been begging for a sip of water. The earth, his earth, was a shattered mosaic of cracked clay. The wheat he'd planted with calloused, hopeful hands was now just a field of pale, brittle ghosts. Even the grasshoppers had surrendered. Daniel leaned on his hoe, the wood hot and smooth beneath his palms. He was 43, but the prairie had a way of carving extra years onto a man's face. He looked 60. His frame was lean, stripped of everything but muscle and bone by years of fighting the stubborn, unforgiving soil. He wiped sweat from his brow with a sleeve that was already dark with it, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was a habit he couldn't break, searching for something that wasn't there. Rain, company, anything. His homestead was an island in an ocean of dead grass. Miles from the nearest neighbor, miles from anything that felt like a town. He'd chosen this isolation. He'd craved it after Margaret died. The fever took her 3 winters ago, leaving him with nothing but 160 acres of government land and a silence in his cabin that was louder than any storm. Solitude was his penance, his shield. That's when he saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance. A shape weaving unsteadily through the dead wheat stalks. It wasn't an animal. It was human. And it was moving all wrong. Stumbling, lurching, with the desperate, erratic gait of someone whose body was giving up. Daniel's heart, a slow and steady drum of lonely routine, suddenly picked up its pace. He squinted, shading his eyes with a hand that was as cracked and dry as the land he worked. It was a girl, a young woman. Native American, from the look of her dress. And she was in trouble, deep trouble. As he watched, she crumpled. Not a gentle fall, but a complete collapse, like a puppet with its strings cut. She hit the hard-baked earth and didn't move. 1 second, 2, 3. Then a shuddering effort as she pushed herself back to her knees, then her feet. He didn't even think. He dropped the hoe and ran. The forgotten tool clattered against the stone-hard ground. But Daniel didn't hear it. All he heard was the thud of his own boots and the rasp of his own breath, a sudden, shocking urgency tearing through the heavy curtain of his grief. This was a different kind of survival. Not his, hers. When he reached her, it was worse than he'd imagined, so much worse. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her face, framed by matted black hair, was flushed with a dangerous, feverish heat. Her lips were split and bleeding, her traditional buckskin dress torn and caked with dust. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were glassy, unfocused, staring into a distance that wasn't there, the final stage of dehydration. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of dying soldiers during the war. It was the look of a soul already starting to unmoor itself from the body. She tried to speak when she saw him, this strange, weathered white man appearing out of the heat haze. But the only sound that escaped her lips was a dry, rasping whisper. The words were in a language he didn't know, maybe Pawnee or Omaha, but their meaning was as universal as pain. Water, help, life. Daniel didn't hesitate. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of action. He scooped her into his arms, and the shock of it almost made him stumble. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of sticks and fever. Her skin burned through the thin fabric of his shirt, a dry, radiating heat that spoke of a fire raging within. She was dying, right here, in his arms, and without help, she wouldn't last another hour. The walk back to his small cabin felt like a mile, though it was only a few hundred yards. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder, murmuring soft words that sounded like prayers. He could feel her pulse, a frantic, fluttering bird trapped beneath her skin. and her breathing was a series of shallow, rapid gasps. Death was closing in, and Daniel was in a foot race to outrun it. He laid her down on his own bed, the one Margaret had shared with him, the one that had been cold for 3 long years. The air inside the cabin was cooler, but still suffocatingly hot. His mind raced. Water. She needed water. But he knew from tending sick livestock in sick people that you couldn't just pour it down her throat. Too much, too fast, could kill her just as surely as the thirst. He had to be careful. He had to be patient. He started with a damp rag, pressing it to her cracked lips, letting her tongue reflexively seek the moisture. Then small sips from a spoon. He held her head, tilting it gently, letting the precious water trickle into her mouth. She swallowed, a gut-wrenching, convulsive movement of a body, desperate for what it had been denied. For the rest of that day and through the long, silent night, Daniel became a guardian. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a nurse, a protector. He bathed her face with cool water from his well, the water level of which was getting dangerously low. When she seemed lucid enough, he spooned thin, salted broth between her lips. He sat in a hard-backed chair beside the bed, watching the slight rise and fall of her chest, his ear tuned to every stutter in her breath. Twice he thought he'd lost her. Her breathing stopped, her body went limp, and the terrible silence of the cabin rushed in to claim another victim. Both times, just as despair began to prick at him, he saw a flicker of an eyelid, felt the faintest ghost of a pulse at her throat. She was a fighter, and so he would fight with her. The fever broke just before dawn. The oppressive heat that had radiated from her skin finally receded. Daniel had dozed off in his chair, head slumped on his chest, and was awakened by a sense of being watched. He opened his eyes. She was awake, and she was looking right at him. Her eyes were clear now, intelligent, a deep, rich brown flecked with gold, like sunlight on dark river water. She studied his face, taking in the tired lines, the rough beard, the sheer exhaustion etched into his features. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet, profound curiosity. "You saved my life," she said. Her voice was weak, raspy, but her English was perfect, laced with a soft, musical accent. The simple gratitude in those 4 words made a strange heat rise in Daniel's cheeks. "Anyone would have done the same," he mumbled, looking away. "No," she said, and her voice held a certainty that was absolute. "Not for someone like me. Not in these times." She was right, and they both knew it. The prairie wasn't a place of kindness between their two peoples. It was a place of suspicion, of fear, of invisible lines drawn in the dust that you crossed at your peril. He had crossed one. "What's your name?" he asked, changing the subject. "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my language." She managed a weak, fleeting smile. "Though I feel more like a blossom left too long in the sun." "I'm Daniel Reed." Ayana nodded, her eyes drifting around the spare, clean cabin. The single room held a bed, a table, a stone fireplace, and shelves of preserved goods. It was the home of a man who lived a life stripped down to its bare essentials. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. The question wasn't an accusation, but it landed like one, stirring the cold ashes of his grief. "My wife. She died 3 years ago. Fever." Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a deep, immediate understanding, a shadow of shared pain. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate, as they always did. He paused, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What were you doing out there? In my field? How did you get so far from water?" Ayana was silent for a long moment, her gaze turning toward the single window, towards the endless, sun-bleached expanse outside. It was as if she was weighing her words, deciding what measure of truth was safe to share with this stranger who had just saved her life. "I was traveling with my grandmother," she began, her voice low and steady, "to visit relatives in the north. We became lost in the heat. The landmarks, they all looked the same. We ran out of water 2 days ago." She hesitated, her throat working. "My grandmother, she couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Daniel saw the whole story in the sudden sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. The brutal prairie had claimed another victim. "Where is she now?" he asked gently. "Dead," Ayana said. The word a small, hard stone dropped into the quiet room. "I buried her as best I could, with rocks. I kept walking. I thought I would die too. Then I saw the roof of your cabin." The image was so stark, so brutal, it made Daniel's chest ache. This young woman, barely more than a girl, burying her own grandmother in the rock-hard dirt, and then stumbling on, alone, carrying that grief while her own body was shutting down. He had to know more. "Are you Pawnee?" She met his gaze, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Pride, caution, a challenge. "Omaha. My father is Chief Ironcloud." The name landed in the room with a tangible weight. Daniel wasn't a man who followed territorial politics, but even he had heard of Ironcloud, a powerful chief, a man known for his wisdom, for walking the razor's edge between protecting his people and avoiding all-out war with the encroaching white settlers. He was respected, and he was feared. Daniel had just saved the daughter of one of the most powerful men on the plains. He had no idea if that was a good thing or a very, very bad thing. "I've heard he's a wise man," Daniel said carefully, choosing his words as if walking through a minefield. "He is," Ayana confirmed, "but wisdom can't stop the sun from burning or guide you when the land itself seems to want you dead." She looked at him then, a deep, searching look. "He will be looking for me, for us." The implication hung in the air. A search party. Not just any search party, a chief search party, looking for his missing, only daughter. They wouldn't be in a good mood. And what would they think when they found her here, in the home of a solitary white man? Daniel's simple act of kindness was suddenly becoming very, very complicated, and the silence in his cabin no longer felt like peace. It felt like the calm before a storm. Over the next few days, as Ayana's strength returned, the story trickled out of her in pieces. She spoke of her grandmother, a wise woman who had read the signs in the sky and the whispers of the wind. But the drought had been a monster that defied all their knowledge. It had warped the landscape, dried up familiar streams, and turned their journey into a death march. The old woman, realizing their water was nearly gone, had given the last of it to Ayana. Every last drop. "She made me promise," Ayana told him one evening, her voice thick with memory as they sat on the small porch, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. "She said the spirits would guide me to help, but only if I did not give up. She gave her life so that I might have a chance at mine." Daniel just nodded, his own throat tight. He understood sacrifice. He understood loss. What he didn't understand was the quiet, steel-cord strength in this young woman. She spoke of her tragedy without a trace of self-pity, with a dignity that humbled him. Her presence was like a splash of cool water on his own parched soul. She had reawakened something in him, a feeling he thought had been buried with Margaret, a connection, a reason to speak, to listen, to be. "What will you do now?" he asked her. "When you're strong enough?" "I must find my father's band," she said, her eyes scanning the hostile horizon. "They will be moving south, away from the worst of the drought. But to travel alone now?" She didn't need to finish. It was a suicide mission. The journey that had killed her experienced grandmother would be even more dangerous for her. A lone native girl in a land simmering with racial tension. "The drought has to break soon," Daniel said, more to convince himself than her. "When the rains come, the streams will fill. Travel will be safer. And until then?" The question was soft, but direct. She was asking for permission to stay, but her pride wouldn't let her beg. Daniel met her eyes. He saw the question and the fear behind it. "Until then," he said, the words feeling more right than anything he'd said in 3 years. "You're welcome to stay here. I have food, water from the well, shelter." Her relief was a visible thing, a softening of her entire posture. "You would do that? For me? Harboring me could bring you trouble." He thought of his distant neighbors, grim-faced men who saw natives as pests or threats. He thought of the isolation he had once cherished. My neighbors are miles away, he said with a shrug, and they've never shown me much kindness anyway. Besides, it's the right thing to do. A genuine smile bloomed on her face, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long night. Daniel felt his own heart lift, a strange and forgotten sensation. You are a good man, Daniel Reed. But Daniel was beginning to suspect that being a good man might not be enough to protect them from what was coming. Because as he watched her, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the skin of her forearm, just below the sleeve of her dress, was a mark. It wasn't a tattoo or a tribal marking. It was a brand, a faint, silvery scar in the shape of a jagged star. It was the kind of mark a rancher might put on cattle, and it sent a cold spike of dread right through his heart. Who was she really running from? The question gnawed at him. He wanted to ask her about the mark, but he didn't know how. It felt like a violation, a prying into a wound she was clearly trying to hide. So he watched, and he waited, and a new kind of tension settled over the small farm. The days fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. Ayana, it turned out, was a force of nature. She helped him tend his withered vegetable garden, her knowledge of plants seeming almost magical. She cooked meals over his hearth, turning his simple stores of flour and salted meat into food that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years. She brought laughter back into the silent corners of his cabin, and in the evenings, they talked. He learned about her people, their stories, their connection to a land he had only ever tried to conquer. She learned about his life, about Margaret, about the quiet grief that had shaped him. A fragile trust was being built between them, a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. But the brand on her arm was a constant, unspoken presence, a secret he could feel humming between them. One afternoon she was mending a tear in his shirt, her fingers nimble and sure, when her sleeve slipped down. The jagged star was stark against her copper skin. He saw her notice his gaze, saw the way she quickly pulled the sleeve back down, her movement suddenly stiff and guarded. It's nothing, she said, her eyes fixed on her sewing. It doesn't look like nothing, Ayana, he said gently. It looks like it hurt. She was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. They were not my people, and they were not yours. Who were they? Daniel pressed, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Men who hunt for things that are not meant to be found, she said cryptically. My grandmother and I, we were not just lost, Daniel. We were running. Before he could ask another question, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, rhythmic jingle of a harness and the soft tread of horses. Not many. Maybe two or three. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the old rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the wooden shutter. 3 men on horseback were sitting just beyond his fence line. They weren't natives. They were white men, but they were unlike any of the settlers he knew. They were hard-looking, dressed in dusty black coats despite the heat, their faces shadowed by the wide brims of their hats. They carried rifles across their saddles, and they sat their horses with a lazy, predatory stillness that made the hairs on Daniel's neck stand up. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at the cabin. Ayana was at his side, her face pale. It's them, she whispered, her voice trembling. The men who hunt. So the trouble he'd been worrying about had finally arrived. But it wasn't who he expected. It wasn't her tribe. It was something else, something much more dangerous. Get in the root cellar, he said, his voice low and urgent. The door's under the rug. Don't make a sound. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a defiant spark. They will kill you. They'll have to find me first, he said, giving her a shove toward the trapdoor. Go. Now. She disappeared into the darkness below, just as a voice called out from outside. A voice that was smooth and oily, yet carried an unmistakable threat. Hello, the house. We know you're in there, farmer, and we know who you're hiding. Send out the girl, and we'll let you live. Daniel's blood ran cold. They knew. They had somehow tracked her here. His isolated farm was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, and he was caught in it with her. He cocked the rifle. The click echoed in the silent cabin like a death sentence. "You're on private property," Daniel called back, his voice rougher than he intended. "I suggest you move on." A dry, humorless laugh answered him. "Your property? This all belongs to the future, friend. And we are the future. Now the girl. She stole something that belongs to our employer. We're just here to get it back." "She's not here," Daniel lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Don't lie to us, farmer," the voice rasped. "We tracked her right to your door. We can see her footprints from here. Last chance. Send her out." Daniel knew this was a crossroads. He could give her up, save his own skin. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. He owed her nothing, really. Just a cup of water, a few days of care. But then he thought of her quiet strength, of the way she smiled, of the story of her grandmother's sacrifice. He thought of the brand on her arm. Whatever these men wanted, it wasn't justice. It was something ugly. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. "You're not taking anyone," Daniel yelled, his decision hardening into resolve. There was a moment of silence. Then the leader spoke again, his voice dropping its fake pleasantries, revealing the cold steel beneath. "Wrong answer." The first bullet splintered the wood of the window frame, showering Daniel with shards. He dropped to the floor, crawling away from the opening, his mind racing. 3 of them. 1 of him. The odds were terrible. His cabin was solid, but it wouldn't stand up to a siege. They could just wait him out, or worse, set it on fire. He had to do something unexpected. He scrambled to the back of the cabin, to the small opening he used for ventilation near the floor. He pushed open the shutter. The horses were tied to his fence. If he could get to them, spook them. It was a crazy idea. He'd be exposed. But staying inside was a death sentence. Another shot rang out, this one punching a clean hole through his wooden door. They were getting impatient. "Okay, Ayanna," he whispered to the floorboards. "Time to see what this old farmer is made of." He took a deep breath, gripped his rifle, and slid out of the back opening, belly crawling into the withered grass behind his cabin. The sun was relentless. The heat rising from the ground was dizzying. He kept his head down, moving slowly, deliberately, towards the fence line where the horses were tethered. His only advantage was surprise. They thought he was pinned down inside. He could hear them talking, their voices carrying in the still, hot air. "Burn him out. Be quicker. Boss wants the girl alive. Says the brand is useless on a corpse." The brand. So it wasn't just about something she stole. The mark itself was the key. Daniel's mind churned. What could it possibly mean? He was halfway to the horses when a twig snapped under his hand. It sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. The talking stopped. "What was that?" one of the men hissed. Daniel froze, pressing himself flat against the cracked earth. He could feel their eyes scanning the property. His heart was a frantic drum. He was caught. It was over. Then a miracle. A gust of wind, a dust devil, kicked up a swirling vortex of dirt and dried leaves right between him and the men. It was only for a moment, a brief, chaotic screen of dust and debris, but it was enough. He didn't wait. He surged to his feet and ran the last 20 yards to the horses, a wild, desperate sprint. He reached them just as the dust devil died down. One of the men shouted, a curse of surprise and anger. Daniel didn't have time to untie the reins. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the rump of the nearest horse. The animal shrieked in pain and surprise, rearing up. The panic was contagious. The other 2 horses bucked and pulled, their eyes rolling in terror. A shot whistled past Daniel's ear, so close he felt the heat of its passage. He dropped and rolled, coming up behind the terrified animals. He slapped another one, screaming like a madman. The tethering rope on the fence post snapped under the strain. 2 of the horses were free. They bolted, galloping wildly across the prairie, their stirrups flying. The 3rd horse was still tied, pulling frantically at its reins. One of the men was running towards him, firing as he came. The bullets thudded into the ground around Daniel. He had no clear shot back. He had to make a choice. Run for the open prairie or get back to the cabin. He chose the cabin. He chose Ayanna. He zigzagged, using the last tethered horse as a shield, then broke for the back of the cabin. A bullet grazed his arm. a searing line of fire that made him cry out. But he didn't stop. He dove headfirst through the ventilation opening, landing in a heap on the floor, gasping for breath, his arms screaming in protest. He had done it. He had evened the odds. Two of them were now on foot, their horses disappearing specks on the horizon. But they were still out there, and now they were furious. The trap door creaked open, and Ayana's head appeared. Her eyes were wide with terror, but when she saw the blood on his arm, her expression changed to one of fierce concern. "You're hurt," she said, climbing out of the cellar. "It's just a scratch," he lied, gritting his teeth as he tore a strip from his shirt to make a bandage. "But we don't have much time. They'll be back." She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly steady as she helped him tie the crude bandage. "You should have given me to them, Daniel. They would have let you live." "Maybe," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "But I reckon a man's got to be able to live with himself after. Now tell me the truth, all of it. What is that brand on your arm? What do they want with you?" Ayana took a deep, shaky breath. The time for secrets was over. "It is not a brand of ownership," she said, her voice low and intense. "It is a map, a key. It marks me as the one who knows the way." "The way to what?" She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw the weight of a secret that could change the fate of her people, and perhaps the entire territory. "To the valley of the hidden spring," she whispered, "a place my people have kept secret for 1,000 years. A place with water that never runs dry, even in a drought like this." Daniel stared at her, the reality of what she was saying sinking in like a stone. A year-round spring. In this wasteland. It wasn't just valuable, it was a miracle. It was power. The kind of power men would kill for. The kind of power the railroad would pay a fortune to control. "And they know about it," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "They do not know where it is," she corrected him, "but they know it exists, and they know that I am the only one of my generation who has been shown the path. The brand. It is their way of marking me, so they could find me again if I ever escaped." So she hadn't stolen anything. She was the thing that was stolen, and she had escaped. "My father was sending me north for safety," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He feared something like this would happen. The hunters ambushed us. They killed the warriors who were guarding us. My grandmother and we managed to get away in the chaos. They have been hunting us ever since." The silence in the cabin was thick with the weight of her confession. Daniel's simple act of kindness had thrust him into the middle of a war over the most precious resource on the prairie. He was no longer just a farmer protecting a guest. He was the guardian of a sacred secret, standing against ruthless men who would stop at nothing to possess it. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The long shadows of dusk would provide cover, for him and for them. "They won't give up," Daniel said, his mind already working, calculating. "They'll either try to storm the cabin tonight, or they'll wait for their friend to come back with more men." "What do we do?" Ayana asked, her eyes trusting him completely. Daniel looked around his small, solid cabin. It was his fortress, his home. He had built it with his own hands. He had mourned his wife here. He had found a new purpose here. He wouldn't let them take it. He wouldn't let them take her. "Tonight," he said, checking the load in his rifle, his face set in grim lines, "we fight." The night was long and suffocating. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every skittering sound of a prairie creature was a man crawling toward the house. Daniel and Ayana sat in the darkness, their backs against the wall listening. He had barricaded the door with his heavy oak table and wedged chairs under the window shutters. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it might buy them seconds. Seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. Hours passed. The silence stretched, becoming more terrifying than any noise. "Maybe they left," Ayana whispered, her voice a small thread in the vast darkness. "No," Daniel said, his senses on high alert. "They're out there. They're being patient. They're waiting for us to make a mistake." He was right. Just after midnight, the attack came. It wasn't a hail of bullets. It was something quieter, more insidious. A scraping sound at the corner of the cabin. Then another. They were trying to pry the logs apart, to create a hole. Then came the smell. Smoke. "They're trying to burn us out," Daniel hissed, his worst fear realized. He scrambled to the water barrel by the hearth. It was less than a quarter full. His well was nearly dry. He had been rationing water for weeks. Now he would have to use the last of it to save their lives. He grabbed a bucket, sloshing the precious water against the inside wall where the smoke was thickest. The wood sizzled. Ayana was right behind him with a tin cup, throwing small amounts of water with desperate accuracy. A triumphant shout came from outside. They knew they had found a weakness. The scraping became more frantic, and then, with a splintering crack, the tip of a crowbar punched through the chinking between two logs. Daniel reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and slammed it against the intruding metal bar. The impact jarred his wounded arm, sending a bolt of agony through him, but he heard a cry of pain from outside. He had hit a hand, but they didn't stop. Now they focused their attack on that one spot, hammering at the logs. Wood splintered. A small hole appeared, then grew larger. Daniel could see a sliver of the moonlit prairie outside. Suddenly, the barrel of a rifle was shoved through the hole. Ayana screamed. Daniel threw himself at her, tackling her to the floor just as the gun went off. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet tore through the far wall, showering them with dust and splinters. They were trapped. The fire was growing, the smoke filling the small cabin, choking them, and the men outside were breaking their way in. This was the end. They had failed. And then Daniel heard it. A new sound. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. A low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. It sounded like distant thunder, but the sky was clear and full of stars. It wasn't thunder. The men outside heard it too. The hammering stopped. Daniel heard one of them shout, "What in God's name is that?" The rumbling grew into a roar, the sound of hundreds of unshod hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. It was horses, many, many horses, coming fast. Daniel scrambled back to the window, risking a look through a peephole. What he saw made his blood freeze, colder than any fear the hunters had inspired. The horizon was moving. A vast, dark line of riders was sweeping across the prairie, silhouetted against the night sky. They stretched from one end of his property to the other, a human tide flowing towards his small besieged cabin. They were native warriors, their forms unmistakable even in the dark. There were hundreds of them, 300, maybe more. He looked at Ayana, who had crawled to his side. Her face was a mixture of awe, relief, and a new kind of fear. "They found me," she whispered. "My father. He found me." Daniel's mind reeled. He had been so focused on the hunters that he had forgotten the other threat. And now they were here. An army. His first thought was a spike of pure terror. The hunters were still out there. Would the warriors know the difference? Would they see his burning cabin and assume he was the one who had harmed her? The two hunters outside had the same thought. Daniel heard them scramble for their one remaining horse. A moment later, he heard the frantic gallop of a single horse fading into the night. They had abandoned the fight, melting back into the prairie that had spawned them. But Daniel's problems were far from over. He was now alone, with the daughter of a chief, in a cabin that was on fire, with an army of warriors descending upon him. He had survived the hunters. He wasn't sure he would survive the rescue. The wave of riders broke around his farm, encircling it with breathtaking speed and precision. They moved not as a mob, but as a disciplined military force. In the flickering light of the fire consuming the corner of his cabin, Daniel could see their faces, stern, grim, painted for war. They carried bows, lances, and rifles. The sheer spectacle of it was terrifying and magnificent. This wasn't just a search party. This was a war party. Daniel quickly doused the last of the flames with the remaining water, his heart hammering in his chest. The immediate threat was gone, but a much larger, more uncertain one had replaced it. A single rider detached himself from the main group and trotted his horse forward. Even from a distance, Daniel could feel the authority radiating from him. He was older than the others, his long hair streaked with gray. His face, illuminated by the moonlight, was a mask of proud, weathered dignity. It was Chief Ironcloud. He stopped his horse 30 yards from the cabin door and simply sat there, his dark eyes taking in the scene. The broken logs, the scorch marks, the solitary white man standing in the doorway with a rifle in his hand. Then Ayanna stepped out from behind Daniel. A collective gasp went through the assembled warriors. For a long moment, father and daughter just stared at each other. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snorting of horses and the whisper of the night wind. Then Ironcloud spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the distance. The words were in the Omaha language, but the emotion was universal, a father's overwhelming relief, grief, and love. Ayanna answered him, her voice clear and strong, and a rapid exchange followed. Daniel stood frozen, feeling like a stranger at the center of a drama he could not comprehend. He heard his own name mentioned, saw Ayanna gesture towards his wounded arm, then towards the splintered walls of his cabin. She was telling him the story, their story. Finally, Ironcloud raised a hand, and she fell silent. He turned his gaze on Daniel. It was an intense, piercing look that seemed to see right through him, weighing and judging him. "You are the man who found my daughter," Ironcloud said, his English slow and deliberate, but perfectly clear. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice hoarse. He lowered his rifle, letting it hang by his side. "She tells me you found her dying, that you carried her to your home, that you gave her water and care." The chief's voice was a flat, unreadable monotone. "She also tells me you just fought to defend her from the men who hunt for secrets, that you took a wound for her." Daniel just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "These are not the actions I have come to expect from your people," Ironcloud continued, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "Most would have left her to die in the field. Or worse, why did you help her? Why did you fight for her?" The question hung in the charged air. 300 warriors waited for his answer. Their bows were strung, their rifles were loaded. This was the most important moment of his life. His answer would determine everything. He thought for a moment, not of a clever reply, but of the simple, unvarnished truth. "Because she needed help," Daniel said, his voice quiet but steady. "Because when someone is dying, and you have the power to save them, nothing else matters. Not the color of their skin, not the trouble it might bring. Nothing." Ironcloud held his gaze for a long time, as if searching for any hint of deception. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was as if Daniel's answer had confirmed something he had hoped, but not dared, to believe. "My daughter has told me everything," the chief said, his voice taking on a more formal, ceremonial tone. "She has told me of the hunters, of the secret they seek, a secret that now you, a white man, also share." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He was the loose end, the liability. "The hunters have escaped," Ironcloud went on. "They will report what they have seen. They will bring others. They now know that the key to the hidden spring is not just a legend, but a living person, and they know roughly where to find her. You have protected my daughter, but in doing so, you have placed yourself and this farm at the center of a storm." The chief paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We are faced with a difficult choice. To protect the secret, I could kill you where you stand. It would be the simplest solution." The warriors behind him shifted, their hands tightening on their weapons. Daniel's heart stopped. He looked at Ayanna, who stared at her father, her expression unreadable. "But," Ironcloud continued, raising his hand to forestall any action, "that is the old way, the path of blood and mistrust that has brought both our peoples nothing but pain. My daughter tells me you are a man of honor, that you have shown more kindness to her than any of your people. She believes you can be trusted." He urged his horse a few steps closer. "Among my people, when a great service is done, a great debt is created. You saved the life of my only child, the future of our tribe. You saved the secret that protects our existence. Such a debt cannot be repaid with horses or blankets. It can only be honored by creating a bond, by making the stranger into family." Daniel felt a dizzying sense of unreality. He had no idea where this was going. "You are a man alone," the chief stated, his eyes glancing at the simple, lonely cabin. "My daughter has lost her grandmother, her protector. She is now a target. She cannot travel freely. I cannot hide her forever. The hunters will not stop." He took a deep breath, And then he delivered the proposal that would shatter Daniel's world. I propose we join our strengths. We tie our fates together. You, Daniel Reed, will take my daughter, Ayanna, as your wife. The words dropped into the stunned silence like a meteor. Daniel stared, speechless. Marriage? To Ayanna? He looked at her and saw a faint blush on her cheeks in the moonlight, but she held her father's gaze, her chin high. This is not a marriage of passion, Ironclad explained, his voice practical, like a general discussing strategy. It is a marriage of purpose, an alliance. As my son-in-law, you will be under my protection. An attack on you will be an attack on all of us. Your farm will become a fortress, a forward post in the fight that is to come, and Ayanna, as your wife, will be protected by the laws of your people. The hunters will find it much harder to simply snatch a white farmer's wife than a lone Indian girl. It was a brilliant, insane political maneuver. It solved a dozen problems at once. It would protect Ayanna, protect Daniel, and formalize an alliance. It would transform a potential conflict into a bond of family. What does Ayanna say about this? Daniel finally managed to ask, his voice a croak. Ironclad turned and spoke to his daughter in their tongue. She replied at length, her voice firm and clear. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the conviction in them. She says, the chief translated, turning back to Daniel, that you have already proven yourself a man of honor and courage. She says you treated her with respect when she was at your mercy. She says she would be proud to be your wife, to build this bridge between our peoples with you. Daniel looked at Ayanna, truly looked at her. He saw not just a political pawn, but a strong, intelligent woman who had survived horrors he could barely imagine. He saw the trust in her eyes and something else, something deeper, a shared understanding born of their shared ordeal. He thought of his empty cabin, of the soul-crushing loneliness. He thought of the laughter she had brought back into it. This wasn't just a political solution. It was a chance at a life he thought he had lost forever. A low rumble echoed from the horizon. This time, it really was thunder. A storm was coming. After weeks of brutal killing drought, the sky was finally breaking. Daniel Reed, the lonely farmer, stepped forward. He looked past the chief, past the 300 warriors, and met Ayanna's eyes. He saw his future there. He turned to Ironclad. I accept, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound certainty. With honor. A great shout went up from the warriors. The tension that had held them in its grip for hours shattered, replaced by a wave of relief and celebration. The ceremony was held right there, as the first drops of rain began to fall. It was a strange and beautiful fusion of worlds. Ironclad performed the Omaha rituals, his deep voice chanting blessings to the spirits of the earth and sky. Daniel, in turn, spoke the simple Christian vows he remembered from his own wedding so many years ago, promising to love, honor, and protect. Ayanna stood between them, a bridge between two cultures. She wore a wreath of wildflowers she had managed to find near the cabin, their colors vivid against her dark hair. As the rain began to fall harder, washing the dust from the air, Daniel took her hand. It felt right. As the vows were completed, a crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The heavens opened, and the drought broke in a glorious, cleansing downpour. The warriors laughed and cheered, turning their faces to the sky, letting the life-giving water wash over them. They saw it as a powerful omen, a blessing on the union. The marriage was a fact. The alliance was sealed. But as Daniel looked at his new wife, and at the formidable army now celebrating on his land, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the war. The hunters who had escaped would not simply give up. They served a powerful, unseen employer who wanted the secret of the hidden spring. The marriage gave Ayanna a new level of protection, but it also painted a giant target on Daniel's back. His farm was no longer a forgotten piece of land. It was the front line. In the days that followed, the farm was transformed. Under Ironclad's direction, a contingent of his best warriors remained behind. They weren't just guards, they were builders. They helped Daniel repair his cabin, reinforcing the walls, building a watchtower on the roof of his barn. They taught him their ways of tracking, of silent movement, of reading the subtle language of the prairie. In return, Daniel taught them about crop rotation, about how to dig a deeper, more stable well, sharing the knowledge of his own world. A strange new community was being forged in the mud of the rain-soaked prairie, a blend of Omaha and settler, of ancient tradition and New World grit. Daniel and Ayana's marriage, born of necessity, began to blossom into something more. In the quiet moments they talked, not as political allies, but as two people who had found an unexpected harbor in each other. He learned the depth of her courage, the sharpness of her mind. She discovered the profound kindness and unwavering strength beneath his weathered, solitary exterior. A genuine affection grew, tender and resilient, like a wildflower pushing its way through cracked rock. But the peace was fragile. The threat of the hunters was a constant shadow on the horizon. Sentries were posted day and night. Every distant rider, every unfamiliar sign was a potential attack. The attack, when it came, was far more cunning than a frontal assault. One morning, a man in a dusty suit arrived in a buggy. He was alone. He wasn't a hunter. He was a lawyer from Omaha City. He carried a deed, officially stamped and registered, that claimed Daniel's 160 acres and all the land surrounding it belonged to the Union Pacific Railroad. He presented Daniel with an eviction notice. He had 1 week to vacate the premises. It was a bloodless, devastating attack. The unseen employer wasn't just using thugs, he was using the law, the white man's most powerful weapon. Iron Cloud and his warriors couldn't fight a piece of paper. Daniel was stunned. He had filed his claim properly. He had worked this land for years. But the lawyer just smiled, a cold, reptilian smile. "The railroad has friends in Washington, Mr. Reed. Your claim has been invalidated, a clerical error. I'm sure you understand." Despair settled over the farm. They had prepared for a fight of arrows and bullets, not one of ink and legal trickery. If they were forced off the land, Ayana would lose her sanctuary. The alliance would crumble. The secret of the spring would be more vulnerable than ever. That night, as Daniel stared at the eviction notice, a piece of paper that held the power to destroy everything, Ayana came to him. "There is a weakness in their plan," she said, her voice calm and steady. "What weakness?" Daniel asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "They have the law on their side." "They have your law," she corrected him gently. "But they are breaking another law, a deeper one. My father has allies not just among the Omaha. He has maintained peace with the Pawnee, the Lakota. For years, the tribes have fought each other. But the threat of the railroad, the iron horse that carves up our lands, is a threat to us all. The man who wants our spring, he is the same man who wants to drive a railroad through their sacred hunting grounds." A plan began to form in Daniel's mind, a desperate, audacious gamble. "A common enemy," he whispered. "Yes," Ayana said, her eyes shining with intelligence. "But they will not listen to my father alone. The old rivalries are too deep. They need a different kind of messenger. Someone who understands the threat in a way they can't. Someone who has seen the white man's greed up close." She placed her hand on his arm. "They need you, Daniel." He looked at her shocked. "Me? Go to the Lakota? They would kill me on sight." "They will not kill the son-in-law of Iron Cloud," she countered. "And you will not go alone. You will go with a message. You will tell them that the fight for your small farm is the first battle in the war for all their lands. You will tell them that the railroad that wants to evict you is the same one that will destroy their way of life. You will ask them to stand with us, not to fight your law, but to create a show of force so large that even the men in Washington will have to listen." It was insane. A lone white farmer riding into the heart of the Lakota Nation to ask the most feared warriors on the plains to join his fight. But it was also the only chance they had. He had to try. With a small band of Iron Cloud's best warriors as his guides and protectors, Daniel Reed rode out. He carried with him not just a message but a symbol, a peace pipe gifted by Iron Cloud, and a single damning piece of paper, the eviction notice. The journey was perilous. They traveled through hostile territory, avoiding settler patrols and rival war bands. Daniel saw the plains not as an empty expanse, but as Ayana and her people saw it, a living world, full of signs and spirits, dangers and wonders. When they finally reached the Great Lakota camp, they were met with a wall of suspicion and hostility. They were surrounded by hundreds of warriors, their faces grim, their weapons ready. Daniel, the lone white man, was the focus of their cold fury. He was brought before the legendary chief, Sitting Bull. The great man's eyes were hard, his face a mask of bitter experience with the white man's promises. "You are either very brave or very foolish to come here, farmer," Sitting Bull said, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Iron Cloud is our friend, but you are not." Daniel, his heart pounding, did not flinch. He looked the chief in the eye. "I am not here as your enemy," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I am here as a man who is losing his home to the same enemy that wants to take yours." He laid the eviction notice on the ground before the chief. "This piece of paper is a weapon, more powerful than any rifle. It is how they will take your land. Not with soldiers, but with lawyers. They start with my farm because it is small, because I am alone. Then they will come for you." He spoke for an hour, his words simple, direct, and honest. He spoke of the hunters, of the greed for the hidden spring, of the railroad's relentless advance. He spoke of his wife, Ayanna, and the alliance that had been forged. He wasn't asking them to fight for him. He was asking them to fight for themselves by making a stand at his farm. "Let them see," he finished, his voice ringing through the silent camp. "Let the men in Washington see that the tribes are united, that an attack on one is an attack on all. Let them see a force so large they dare not provoke a war over one small piece of land." There was a long silence. Sitting Bull stared at the eviction notice, then at Daniel. He saw not a typical settler, but a man who had crossed a line, who had bound his fate to the native people. He saw a man who spoke the truth. The great chief rose to his feet. "You have the heart of a warrior, Daniel Reed," he said. He turned to his people. "We will ride with Iron Cloud." When Daniel returned to his farm, he was not with a small band of Omaha. He was at the head of a force that staggered the imagination. Behind him rode the warriors of the Omaha, the Pawnee, and the mighty Lakota. Over 1,000 warriors, the largest gathering of tribes the plains had seen in a generation. They had answered the call. They arrived on the final day, the day the eviction was to take place. The lawyer from the railroad came as promised, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by a platoon of U.S. cavalry, there to enforce the order. They crested the hill overlooking Daniel's farm and froze. Below them, stretched across the valley, was an army. The sun glinted off 1,000 lances and rifle barrels. War ponies stamped the ground. The air was thick with the silent, menacing power of a united people ready to fight and die for their land. The cavalry captain took one look at the impossible odds and turned to the lawyer. "You said this was a simple eviction of one farmer," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You did not say we'd be starting a war with the entire Sioux Nation." The lawyer's face was pale, his smug confidence gone, replaced by pure terror. Iron Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Daniel Reed rode out to meet them. "This is my land," Daniel said, his voice steady, "and these are my family. You will not take it." The captain, a veteran who knew an unwinnable fight when he saw one, made his decision. He would not sacrifice his men for the railroad's greed. He tipped his hat to Daniel. "This appears to be a matter for the politicians to sort out, sir. We will be withdrawing." He turned his troops and rode away, leaving the lawyer sputtering in his dust. They had won. They had won without firing a single shot. They had fought with an idea, with unity, and it had proven more powerful than any law or army. The great gathering of tribes was a celebration of victory. A new era of cooperation had begun, forged in the fire of a common threat. The railroad, faced with a political nightmare and the threat of a massive, unified uprising, quietly rescinded the eviction notice. The unseen employer, whoever he was, had been defeated. His hunters were never seen on the prairie again. Daniel Reed was no longer the lonely farmer. He was a leader, a bridge between two worlds. He and Ayanna built a life on that farm, raising children who had the blood of both peoples in their veins. Their home became a meeting place, a symbol of the peace and understanding that could be achieved. The secret of the hidden spring remained safe, a source of life for the Omaha, protected by an alliance that had changed the course of history on the plains. It all started with a simple act of kindness, a man giving water to a thirsty girl. It shows that you never know how one small choice can ripple outwards, transforming not just your own life, but the world around you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to simply choose compassion in a world that expects suspicion. What would you have done in Daniel's place? It's easy to say we do the right thing, but when faced with real danger, our choices define who we truly are. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible tales from the forgotten corners of history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for listening.